r/NoSleep. Posted by u/withbite. When the bell rings, do not go outside. This was a rule I had to break. Please like and subscribe to support us. I was on the run. I had gambling debts that I could not pay, and the people I owed money to followed their own laws. There'd be a tap on the shoulder before you were bundled into a van and disposed of somewhere quiet. This had happened to people I knew. Other addicts, hunched over cards in the back room of a seedy bar as another hand of poker got away from them, or standing at the side of a racetrack, a stale beer and a cigarette for company as the horse everything depended on limped home last. It had got so bad that even I knew that my luck had run out. So, I had to get away. I withdrew the last of the cash I had from an ATM, glancing over my shoulder all the while, then hurried to the coach station and bought a ticket to some place I knew nothing about, apart from the fact it was a long way away. Waiting in line at the bay to board the coach, I kept imagining someone was walking up behind me. I turned but there was no one there. By the time I boarded, I was drenched in sweat. As the miles passed, I started to breathe a little easier. I had no plan beyond this point. Surviving was the total of my life ambitions and it looked like I had nailed that. 4 days later, I reached the end of the line. I stood by the side of the road, stretching and yawning. There was a gas station, a diner with an old dog sleeping in the doorway. I stepped over the mud and dug around in my pockets until I had enough for a coffee and some eggs. As I was finishing up eating, I saw a trucker climbing on board his rig. I strolled out and asked if I could hitch a ride. He shrugged his shoulders, said, "Sure." A few hours later he dropped me off on the outskirts of a small town that I'd spotted on the horizon and impulsively liked the look of. I thanked him and started walking. It was a nice day. The sun shone in a clear blue sky. Untended fields lay between the road and the town. Soon I was wading through wild grass that in places reached up to my waist. I held out my hands and let the grass flow through my fingers, and by the time I reached the edge of town, I felt relaxed and happy for the first time in a long while. The buildings I passed were quaintly old-fashioned and, before long, I realized they were clustered around a square, on one side of which stood a church. This was by far the largest and most impressive structure in town. Gargoyles perched over arched stained glass windows looked down on the square. A tower rose above the entrance. Inside it, a bell glinted in the sunlight. I paused to take in the sight. I wasn't a religious person but the church and the homely structures gathered around it added to my new sense of calm. I hadn't seen anyone yet, but I could smell fresh baked bread and, suddenly famished, I followed my nose. It led me down a walkway between two houses and I emerged into a backyard to see not only bread but cakes and cuts of meat and jugs of lemonade laid out on a long wooden table. I hesitated. There was still no sign of any townsfolk and I was fighting the temptation to just help myself when I heard singing. It was faint, harmonious. I did not recognize the tune and wondered, in a town where the church was literally at the center of the community, if it was a hymn. I listened as sound of the gathered voices grew louder and a few minutes later saw the first of the singers. A man dressed in what my late grandparents would have called a Sunday best appeared at the end of the walkway. He had a long black beard and ruddy cheeks. He was followed by a procession of women, men and children. Shoes had clearly been polished especially, hair slicked back. It was not the Sabbath and there'd been no sign of anyone inside the church when I was there, so I figured this could have been some kind of local tradition. My on-the-hoof deduction seemed confirmed when a young woman came into view. She wore a long flowing dress and had a garland of flowers around her head. Whoever she was clearly the center of attention. So much so, that no one had noticed the gawping stranger standing there. Until the man leading the procession came to a sudden halt and stared at me. It was hard to tell exactly beneath that voluminous beard, but he didn't look pleased to see me. The singing trailed off as the rest of the townsfolk realized there was an interloper, and a painful silence descended. The bearded man was the first to speak. "You are not welcome here," he told me. "We are celebrating my daughter's birthday. She turns 21 today and is dear to all our hearts." Geez, I thought. Talk about being unwelcome. I held up my hands. "I'm sorry," I said. "I was looking for somewhere to rest up and do a bit of thinking while I get my life back on track. Thought maybe here would be ideal. But clearly that's not the case, so I'll say sorry and be on my way." I forced a smile onto my face and looked over at the young woman. "And I wish you many happy returns," I said, then started walking. I'd taken a dozen or so steps when someone called out, "Wait." I glanced back. A woman was heading towards me. "It will be dark soon," she said. "And there is no place else for you to find shelter for hundreds of miles. So, spend the night here and be safe." As she spoke, I could see the similarity between her and the young woman. It turned out the wishes of the mother of the birthday girl were not to be argued with. Her husband still looked furious under his beard, and the rest of the townsfolk milled around sullenly, but no one said anything. The woman put her hand on my arm and led me away. She showed me into an outbuilding. There was straw on the floor and the unmistakable smell of dung. The prospect of sleeping in a barn really did not appeal to me, and I was about to protest when she said, "Heed me well, stranger. There is a curfew here tonight. When the bell in the church tower rings, you must not go outside. When the bell stops ringing, be on your way and never return. Do you understand?" She looked me in the eye. Her expression was cold and hard. I must admit a shiver went down my spine. All thoughts of complaining forgotten, I nodded meekly. She turned and left me, closing the door behind her. I stood there in the gloom. The only sound was my stomach rumbling. I tried to get comfortable, but it was no use. The straw was no substitute for a mattress and it made my skin scratch like crazy. I started to pace around. Back in my home city there'd be races to bet on and card games, football to phone in wagers on, and, of course, the internet, the gambler's nirvana and worst nightmare all rolled into one. Out there in the middle of nowhere, I had nothing. Not even a signal on my phone. I had no choice but to go cold turkey. It was hellish and the barn started to feel very claustrophobic. I was about to start looking around for bugs on the ground that I could race against each other and somehow bet on, when the bell started to ring. It was a clear, sharp sound. I stood and listened. The bell struck at a steady heartbeat's pace. After a while, I decided that opening the door of the barn and peeking out wouldn't be breaking the curfew and a bit of fresh air might help my nerves. The sun had almost set and a blood-red sky was darkening. There was no light pollution and I marveled at the stars I could already see. The entrance to the barn faced the fields I had walked through earlier. I could make out the wild grass swaying gently in the wind. As the bell continued to toll, the last of the daylight was lost and the night was complete. Moments later I saw a small dark shape rise from the fields, and then another. They drifted higher, circled each other, and then I saw a third, a fourth appear, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness I could make out their wings. They were cutting through the air with a bewitching grace and speed, and as more rose and joined the spectacle, I found it impossible to separate them. Soon they were moving as one swirling mass and filling the sky, into which I stared spellbound. Then, all of a sudden, they swooped, downwards, back to earth, and someone began to scream. A woman. It sounded like she was out there, in the fields, where the dark shapes had descended. She screamed again. Surely the townsfolk would be able to hear her as well, I thought. Surely someone would come to her aid? But there was no sight of anyone and the screams continued, sounding more and more desperate. The bells were still ringing, but curfew would have to go to hell, I decided. Whoever was crying out was in serious trouble, and I had to help them. I ran from the barn, ran towards the screaming. The grass struck my legs as I hurried through it. The screaming was getting louder. And I could see the dark shapes were close and circling something. They were like a tornado of living beings. I ran faster and threw myself into their midst. One after another struck me and I realized with a jolt of shock that they were bats. And that they were surrounding the screaming woman. She was tied by thick ropes to a wooden stake driven into the ground, and at the mercy of the bats. It was the young woman who had been at the center of the festivities. Now, her face was a mass of cuts. The garland of flowers was stained with her blood. Her dress was torn and beneath it fresh wounds opened as the bats attacked. They were in a frenzy. A bloodlust. And they would kill her, if I did not get her out of there. I grabbed one of the ropes holding her and pulled, and swore. It wouldn't give. Sharp pains exploded on my scalp and neck. The bats were attacking me as well now. Fear raced through me. I felt dizzy, nauseous. Warm blood trickled down my forehead as the bats' assault continued. Their teeth were razor sharp and everywhere, on my hands, my back, my face. Biting, tearing, merciless. Still, I managed to reach around to the back of the stake, find the knot securing the ropes, and untie it. The young woman fell forwards, a final scream collapsing into a sob. I put my arm around her and half carried, half dragged her away. The bats continued to throw themselves at us. I was dizzy and close to blinded by the blood from my wounds, but knew if I collapsed that would be the end of both us. Somehow, I found the strength to keep going and eventually we reached the barn. With one last effort I got us inside, then kicked the door shut behind us. Outside, I could hear the bats slamming against the barn. Their storm raged on, but without us now caught in their midst. I collapsed onto my knees and vomited. When I had finished, I fumbled around in my pockets and found my mobile, turned it on so at least there would be some light. The young woman rolled onto her side and groaned. She was very badly cut up, but I did not think her life was in danger. I didn't have the strength to fist pump the air and holler in triumph, so I settled for turning to her and gasping, "You're going to be okay." She looked at me and said, "You idiot. What have you done?" I was shocked. "I saved your life," I replied. She shook her head. "No," she told me. "You've killed us all." I looked at her blankly. "I don't understand," I said. She sat up, hugged her knees to her face. "Every family gives up their firstborn when they reach their 21st birthday. This is the bargain the people of the town made so that they can be left to live their lives. I was to be the sacrifice this night, and though I could not bear the pain, my suffering would have been brief, and tomorrow my body would have been carried through the town to my burial place, and my kin and my neighbors would have been safe. Until you interfered. Now, all will die." Her voice rippled with anger as she spoke. It was clear she believed what she was saying, but, even though I knew how vicious the bats could be, I did not understand how an entire town could fall to them. "They're animals," I told her. "Brutal and savage, yes, but we're human beings. We're superior." She looked at me like I was stupid. "It's not the bats we fear," she said. "It's the darkness they contain." She glanced up as she spoke. I followed her gaze, and fear was reignited inside me when I saw them. I thought all the bats were outside, but some had made it in before I closed the door. They hung from the rafters, each one with its wings wrapped around its body. The tips of their fangs showed through the lines of their mouths. I watched as their wings began to unfurl and flicker, and then the bats were hovering in the air just above us. As they had done when they first emerged from the fields, they started to mingle, then flew in circles, faster and faster until they were a blur, merging together into one dark shape. A shape that was taking on a new form. I could see a face, a torso, and, at first, two great wings. The bats had transformed. They had become a new and hideous creature. It was both man and bat. Its wings had narrowed down into arms. Its flat nose pointed upwards and its mouth was a gash lined by curved, sharp teeth. Its eyes were pools of darkness, and when it spoke its voice was quiet and sure. "You have broken the covenant between your people and mine, and without the blood of one to sate our need all must pay." The young woman began to cry. "Please," she said. "It's not our fault. He did this." She got to her feet then continued. "I will go back outside. I will stand willingly and let you feed until my blood is thick on your lips and I have no more to give." The creature fixed her with its gaze. I was certain it was going to lash out, kill her on the spot, and then me. I was going to die and there was not a damn thing I could do about it. Then the creature smiled. Its mouth curled and opened and its fangs showed pale and terrible in the faint glow of the light from my phone's screen. "You have one thing to give," it said. "One bargain we can make." "What?" she asked. "The stranger saved you from the death that would have left you mutilated, a hideous corpse. He has saved you. And your beauty." The creature stepped forwards, reached out and rested a hand on her cheek. Her face was a network of cuts and smeared with blood, but she was still beautiful. A single tear ran down her cheek, carrying blood as it fell. The creature caught it on its fingertip, placed the bloodied tear to its grotesque lips. "You have to agree to this," it said. "You have to give willingly. To want to become one with us." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." The creature leant forwards and kissed her neck, a kiss which lingered, and I saw blood spreading out across her skin as the kiss became something more. A giving and a taking. A joining. He placed his arms around her, and they became wings, which enveloped her. And then they began to turn slowly in a circle, like lovers, like newlyweds lost in their first dance, caring for nothing but their embrace. Their turning increased in pace until it became a blur of movement, which broke apart, and bats spiraled out, into the air. I stood, feeling unsteady, but knowing what I must do. I opened the barn door and moved aside as the bats started past. They slipped away, and out of sight. The creature and his bride. The vampires.